Well, joining me here in studio to discuss the latest in Sri Lanka is CBN's senior international correspondent George Thomas and Dr. Daniel Mark, assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. Thanks for being with us, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Well, Dr. Mark, we'll start. I should mention Dr. Mark is the former chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. George, let's begin with you. Actually, we're hearing that churches and mosques have decided to cancel their services indefinitely. What's prompted this?
Well, as Heather just mentioned, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister said today he's very concerned that there are several individuals on the run. Some of them may still have explosive devices, and so they are telling residents of Colombo, of Jaffna, across the country to be on high alert. And in a very unusual move, as Heather mentioned, the U.S. Embassy in Colombo made a very specific warning, saying that houses of worship this coming weekend may be a target. So they have to be on alert, warning U.S. citizens to be aware of that, as well as the British government has issued a similar warning to its citizens in the country. So again, this country is very much on high alert as they continue to round up individuals. I think close to about 65 individuals have been rounded up so far. But the threat is still very, very real, Wendy.
All right. Dr. Mark, how would you compare the media's coverage of the massacre of Muslims in New Zealand to attacks of Christians in Sri Lanka?
Well, it's been pretty different. I think we've seen more coverage of the attacks in New Zealand and more intense coverage, which is not to say there wasn't some reporting on Sri Lanka. Of course, every major news organization picked it up at first. I think this is rooted in an idea that Christians are oppressors and not the oppressed. That's, of course, the liberal narrative in the West, the idea that Christians have the privilege and Christians have a history of oppressing everybody else. And it confounds that narrative when we recognize that the vast numbers of millions of Christians outside of the West suffer persecution in too many countries. In fact, Christians suffer persecution in more countries than any other religion on the planet. And it's difficult for the media to get their minds around it. As the New York Times conservative columnist pointed out, the Washington Post put the focus on the anger among conservative Christians in America over the attacks, as opposed to the horrific tragedy that occurred and the deaths of the people.
It's hard to imagine how they come up with that. All right, George, moving to you. You've been to Sri Lanka. What are your sources in the country saying about how Christians are coping just days after the attacks?
Yeah, Wendy, I just received an email from the superintendent of the Assemblies of God in Sri Lanka. And he said, according to him, intelligence sources actually previously warned some of the church leaders of such an attack, but they never expected the destruction to be so huge. This is also important. They've sent out a prayer alert to the entire country, saying that the evangelical and Pentecostal churches are standing in solidarity with the Catholic Church in this time of tragedy. They're saying that they want to have a spirit of unity as a witness to the nation. Obviously, you see the funeral services that are taking place, the agony on the faces of so many people who have lost loved ones. They're hoping that these funeral services will be a witness for forgiveness and reconciliation, and also giving hope to other religious communities. Obviously, this is a very, very trying time, but the church across the board, Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, they're all together, banded together, united in this.
Well, Dr. Mark, let me ask you, as a member of the Jewish community, why do you think most Americans don't understand how much suffering Jews and Christians worldwide endure for their faith?
Sure. Well, part of it, I think, has to do with what we just discussed, and that's the media coverage. If the Sri Lanka attacks got the same level of coverage as the New Zealand attacks, people and everything else that's going on, too, the persecution of Christians in China and many other places, people would know about it more. It's hard for people to follow everything that's going on in the world. And if the mainstream media doesn't cover it much, people aren't going to know. I think another thing about which speaks a little bit to maybe a difference between the Jewish and Christian communities, and it helps, of course, that the Jewish community worldwide is so much infinitely smaller than the Christian community, but there is a real sense of kinship among Jews worldwide. And I can tell you in the kind of synagogues I've attended in my life, if Jews are in trouble, is a bill to the Jews everywhere else in the world. Certainly in America, American Jews were instrumental in protesting for and fighting for the rights of Jews in the former Soviet Union who were refused exit from there. And I think Christians who, of course, are extremely charitable and extremely caring to people worldwide, could maybe even so take a lesson in this and make sure that on the top of their minds at all times is the persecuted church around the world, which will help them appreciate what we have here too, and also be mindful of how much we need to protect what we have here.
Yeah, that's very good. All right, George, the New York Times ran an opinion piece this week asking, are Christians privileged or persecuted? Where do you think that line of questioning is coming from?
Well, I think it speaks to some of what Dr. Mark has just highlighted, this idea that Christians in America, by and large, compared to Christians in South America, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, are by and large wealthier. And so this idea is that, well, if you are doing well in America, you are clearly not suffering for your faith. You're not getting beheaded. You're not getting stripped and having electric prods being put to your private parts, and you're suffering for your faith. But that is the wrong way to look at the prism of the suffering church, because the reality is that today, as you know, when the global south is experiencing an explosion of Christianity, and in that global south, the majority of the Christians are not wealthy and they are suffering for their faith, and we have got to stand together with them in this moment of crisis.
Absolutely. They need our prayers more than ever. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.